Lovely to meet you all. My name is Dr. Tony Loyd. I'm the Chief Executive of the ADHD Foundation Neurodiversity Charity. I'd like to thank Equism Pro in the USA for inviting me here this afternoon to share with you some information around the ADHD and omega fatty acid connection. So ADHD, as you know, is one of a number of neurodevelopmental conditions. There is this umbrella of neurodevelopmental conditions that includes autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, or developmental coordination disorder, as it's sometimes known, Tourette's, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. And we know that these conditions rarely travel alone. They frequently co-occur, and that for many people they may have traits that are sub-threshold for another diagnosis of one of these other conditions, but they may display traits. So there is a great deal of symptom overlap across the various different neurodevelopmental disorders. And while this afternoon our focus is really about ADHD, we do need to see them in the context of this umbrella term that we call neurodevelopmental conditions. And the image that you can see here behind me is of the Neurodiversity Umbrella Project. And that's really part of a movement that's beginning to sweep across the world and is particularly strong in the UK, where we're now talking about neurodiversity. It was a term that was coined by an Australian social worker called Judy Singer, and of course there's been a great deal written about it by a number of leading experts in the USA, like Steve Silberman, among others, where really what we're saying is that if 1 in 5 people are neurodiverse, if 1 of 5 people rather are neurodivergent, 1 in 5 have either dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, so on and so forth, then that's 20% of the human population. And are we really saying that 20% of all human beings are somehow disordered or have an error, or genetically inferior or abnormal? So a neurodiverse paradigm is really challenging that 19th century deficit model of intelligence, ability, and employability. So what we're saying is that yes, we know these different conditions can really be very, very impairing, especially when they're not identified and they're not treated, which will change somebody's entire life chance trajectories. What we're saying is if we can identify and support children at a very young age, then we can significantly change their life chances and significantly improve their outcomes, not just in terms of their ability to learn and function cognitively, but also in terms of their physical health and their mental health, as well as obviously their economic prosperity and opportunities as they transition into adult life, employment, careers, and having their own families. So 1 in 20 people have ADHD. It's estimated that somewhere between 1 in 50 and 1 in 67 people have autism. Dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, again, all in the region of about 5% of the population. Tourette's, about 1% of the population. Now, the global prevalence of ADHD is 5.26%, but in the USA, it's actually in the region of about 11%. And there are reasons for that as well. But coming back to this idea that we are beginning to see an emerging paradigm of what's called a strength-based approach. We are no longer looking at people or children with ADHD or these other learning impairments or differences as less than. We are not viewing them from a deficit-based perspective. And there's a good reason for that. Apart from an inclusive ethos, it is also about challenging this idea that we've got to sort of move away from telling children and young people about what they cannot do and what they are not able to do and in what way they are disabled, to a more strength-based approach, talking about, what we can do that will help them realize their potential. And this deficit model often is just about language. And again, we're not saying that having ADHD doesn't impair you. And in medical language, the very definition of a disorder is when your life is so impaired, you really need expert help and support to help you overcome it or live with it successfully. Now, an ADHD diagnosis can mean a number of different things, but until very recently, particularly in our education system, then the automatic kind of stereotype and stigmatized kind of profile is, well, here's a fidgety child who can't sit still, who won't do as they're told, who just can't concentrate. A lot of these things are really gross oversimplifications. And we're not, again, talking about this challenge between a medical model and a social model of disability. When we're talking about neurodiversity, we are kind of looking at that intersection between a medical model and a social theory of disability. And bringing together this idea that yes, there are differences, yes, there are impairments, but actually, if we think about our concept of intelligence and ability and employability, which was largely defined in the 19th century, based on measurement in a certain way in standardized tests, then of course the 20% of young people who don't have standardized minds are going to underachieve in school. And what we're seeing particularly here in Europe is a lot of young people who have ADHD or dyslexia or whatever other neurodevelopmental condition it is saying, do you know what, I will not be labelled as low ability. Don't tell me I am of low intelligence. I have a different type of ability and intelligence. Yes, I face certain challenges, but given the right support, then there's no reason why I can't lead a very happy, healthy and successful life. And I use the analogy of glasses. I mean, I don't know how many of you wear glasses, but if you were to have your glasses taken away from you now, would you be able to do your job properly? And if you weren't able to do your job properly, do you think you would be able to keep your job? Possibly not, you get fired. In school, when we see children struggling to read, if we test their eyesight and find out that it's not that they have low ability, it's actually the fact that they have a visual impairment, we give them glasses and that removes the impairment. In the 21st century, having a great memory, which was really important in the 19th century, is perhaps not as important in the 21st century when we all have smartphone technology with so much information at the end of our hands. So really it's about context. Neurodiversity is about context. What we're saying is if we can remove the impairment, whether that's with assistive technology, with good nutrition, with healthy lifestyle choices, with medication, whatever it takes, then by removing a lot of that impairment, then we are enabling rather than disabling. So, and I think I've really got to pay credit here to a lot of the major growth companies in the world right now, many of them from the USA, particularly in tech, like Google, Apple, Microsoft, those organizations who are some of the fastest growing organizations in the world, influencing our culture and our commerce in ways that are unbelievable from what we were experiencing 20 years ago. Those businesses have been actively recruiting neurodivergent employees for quite some time. And, using this quote of Steve Jobs, think differently. If we all thought the same, nothing would ever change. And however much we might like to always be around people of like mind who always agree with us, it helps to improve things when we have people seeing things from a different perspective. And here's the thing, we cannot have a world where we automatically exclude or rule out 20% of the world's population, 20% of children and young people in the USA who have a right to achieve their potential and thrive. And that is about us understanding how their brains work, and helping them to learn, enabling them to be healthy, happy, and achieve their potential. So it is about a new 21st century concept of neurodevelopmental conditions, but it is strength-based and it is positive. And I think it's important that we do reinforce that message for our children and young people and think about, what are the things that we know are real positives in ADHD, like creative thinking, real lateral information processing, being able to identify patterns and designs in ways that neurotypical people can't, that drive, that passion, that enthusiasm. These are the things that might explain why the research is telling us that as many as 30% of all entrepreneurs or CEOs have ADHD. So what is it about those people that makes them successful? And yet what is it often about our education system and sometimes our culture that sees those with ADHD as somehow less able? And really it is about challenging that disabling attitude and perception. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental delay. We know that there is a developmental lag of 2 or 3 years, and some research even suggests that it might be up to a third of the child's age. And we see those developmental delays presenting as challenges such as poor executive functioning skills, rigid kind of thinking sometimes, poor working memory, very easily kind of overloaded in terms of cognitively, sometimes heightened sensory responses or difficulty with integrating senses, and difficulty with emotional regulation. So we all know if we've got children with ADHD or we're working with children with ADHD, we see a lot of frustration, we see a lot of intolerance, and sometimes even a lack of what appears to be a lack of motivation, which is really about that procrastination and difficulty with task initiation. And there's a lot of work being done in schools that is around helping young people with ADHD scaffold and approach learning in a systematic, step-by-step, sequential way. And we're seeing much better outcomes for children in education through adapted teaching and learning strategies. The most debilitating, and there's been some great work by the likes of Dr. Russell Barkley, Steve Ferroni, Tom Brown in the States, looking at what executive functioning actually is. And if you think about this idea that, being able to control and regulate your emotions is an absolutely essential skill for any human being. Being able to keep those feelings in check and not always allow them to influence how you are going to respond or choose not to respond and in what way. Things like flexible thinking, being able to transition from one task or activity to another. Being able to hold things in what we call working memory, this idea that we can have so many things in our working memory, but we can quickly go into cognitive overload. And we've had, lots of really wonderful analogies, haven't we, about ADHD. Dr. Ned Halliwell describes it as having a Ferrari brain, but with bicycle brakes. Someone else, I think, has also described it as being in a room with 4 different televisions that are all playing different channels, and it's difficult really to assimilate what's happening because there is just too much information. And maybe it's not about an attention deficit at all. Maybe it's about attentional regulation, that ability to filter all the information that's coming from our environment, but also that information that is arising out of our own personal experience and learning and mood and all of those other things internally that might influence how we experience the world around us and how we process the information from the world around us and how we assimilate that with everything that is happening within ourselves, and particularly in children, how we regulate our emotional state. Because remember, children don't have very well developed frontal lobes. Children live very much in the moment, which is why they laugh and smile a lot more than adults do. But here's the interesting thing: children laugh a great deal more, they worry less about tomorrow. And I don't think that's something we should take away from children. It is one of the wonderful things about being a child, isn't it? Childhood is something to be enjoyed, not raced through or got over or completed. But we have to understand as well that, children's brains don't fully develop until they're in their late teens, early 20s. And there are these two genetic drivers in human beings, aren't there? One is to attach to your primary caregiver so that you feel safe, but that other is to want to explore your world and your environment and learn about it and understand what your place is in that environment. And certainly for the hyperactive child, they're going to be climbing over everything and wandering away, and and mum and dad are probably going to be a little bit more worried for their safety than others. So there's some research that says that parents might sanction children with ADHD a lot more than they do their neurotypical children. But here's the reality, is that it is inherent in us to have that love of learning and to understand and explore our environment. But there is also this genetic imperative that is relationship driven, that needs for us to attach to a primary caregiver so that we feel safe and loved and be in a space really where we belong, because we are a social species. We live in relationship with others, whether it's the family group, the classroom group, the supporters on the beaches, the local reading club. We have different social groups, and there are different social mores and rules within each of those different groups. And we learn to regulate our behavior in a way that allows us to belong to those different social groups, because we have shared values, ideals, interests, and things like that. So all of these things that you can see here in this diagram around executive functioning skills are absolutely crucial, but also often impaired in ADHD. So from a neurodiverse perspective, if 20% of human beings are neurodivergent, if 20% of human beings are different, and in the States, if more than 11% of you have ADHD, then we've got to start talking about, well, there is an evolutionary purpose for you being here. The world is a better place for people and children with ADHD. They are incredibly creative, entrepreneurial, number of extraordinarily talented people in the arts, and technology who have ADHD, who play a really important part in our life, in our culture, in our economy. They have been described as the rebel minds and the disruptors, but the world is definitely a better place for them being here. So what do we do to really enable the 11%, the 1 in 10 people in the United States who have ADHD, in order for them to achieve their potential, to thrive and be happy? And we know that early intervention and what happens in our early life is an important part of that. So if we think about not just inclusion, but actually start seeing ADHD not purely from a deficit perspective, but also from some of these strength-based perspectives, then we are going to be enabling. And remember, children believe what we tell them they are. And yes, we remind them that they are lovable and they're intelligent, but let's really make a point of talking about ADHD in a much more positive kind of language. Again, not to deny how difficult and challenging ADHD can be for some people, depending on the extent to which it impairs them. But what we do know is that while ADHD is genetic, we know that the environment and environmental factors, particularly in childhood, influence how our DNA, how our genetic profile actually manifests and presents as we develop. So again, 69 million millionaires, I think, was in the latest research that I read in the United States, and 40% of them were dyslexic. And you're just thinking, wow, you know, what is it about these people that are so talented, so creative, that enables so many of them to be successful? And yet we also know that the flip side of that coin is that if we don't identify, diagnose and support ADHD early in a child's life, then the outcomes are going to be quite different. They're going to underachieve at school, and there is an increased risk of poor physical, mental health and economic deprivation and dependency in adult life. So coming to ADHD, DSM describes 3 core characteristics: inattention, which is poor concentration, poor working memory, distractibility, and all of those also impact on long-term memory. Impulsivity, not just of action or words, but also of thought and emotions. A lot of people with ADHD describe their minds as being hyperactive, but it's also that inability to filter. So impulsivity, hyperactivity, inattention, really there's this complex interplay between these core characteristics. And yet what we notice most is the H, is the hyperactivity. What the teacher in the classroom notices most, notices most is the hyperactivity. What the parent who is, you know, out in the shops or doing whatever it is, they know that what they are noticing most is that hyperactivity, because they want to keep their child safe. And remember, there's a lot of pressure on parents, isn't there, to be that perfect parent, to have the perfectly well-behaved child, when in reality there is no such thing, you know. So really it is, I think, understanding that yes, these 3 things can really kind of present in different ways in different children and in different contexts. But if we understood them as well in the context of secondary characteristics, as well as the cultural context of what we expect children and young people to do and say, and how they should behave and how they should learn. So a lot of clinicians now, when they're looking at how they diagnose and agree a treatment regimen for ADHD, they're looking at what the developmental delay is. So this idea that, you know, there is this 2 to 3 year developmental delay, where perhaps maybe this idea about children with ADHD not behaving comes from, because it's not a moral impairment, and certainly ADHD medication is not a morality pill. That's not how it works. But we see children who don't act their chronological age. They stand out from their peers in school because they are a little bit less mature, because they don't have that regulation, that self-regulation skill that comes with different stages of maturation. So we know there is a developmental delay. We know there are poor executive functioning skills. Low emotional resilience is another secondary characteristic that a lot of clinicians factor in when looking at ADHD, because low emotional resilience can lead to hypersensitivity. There's even research that suggests that those with ADHD are much more sensitive to rejection. And there is even a term for rejection sensitivity dysphoria. So we're looking at a number of different characteristics as well as the core characteristics. So, you know, a lot of people talk about, well, is ADHD, you know, is it mild, moderate and severe? And I think, again, we've got to move away from this idea that ADHD is some kind of linear disorder where you know, you only have it mild, or you only have it moderately, or you only have it severe. It's much more sophisticated than that. You know, we have to think in terms of the spectrum, if you like, in a similar way that we do with autism. If you think of ADHD neurology a bit like a graphic equalizer rather than a line, where there are lots of different slides for different cognitive functions. Some of those slides are fixed because there are genetic inheritance, and then there are other slides on that graphic equalizer that are influenced by our environment, such as how we're parented, our education, whether we experience traumatic events in childhood, the nutrition that we have in childhood, the kind of or quality of sleep we had in childhood. All of these things will influence how our DNA presents and how those differences impact on the gene variants that are involved in ADHD. So in terms of neurobiology of ADHD, we know that it's both structural, functional and neurochemical. In other words, those with ADHD, like those with autism and dyslexia and dyspraxia, their brains are structurally and functionally different. They work in a different way, and how they metabolize and utilize certain neurotransmitters is also different from the neurotypical population. So again, looking at ADHD specifically here in the USA, we know that children and young people between the age of 4 and 17 have ADHD. That's in the region of 6.1 million children. And we know that in half those cases, that ADHD presentation persists into adulthood. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean you grow out of ADHD? No, it doesn't. You have ADHD and you have it for life. When we say that half of adults are not symptomatic in adulthood, what we mean by that is they have learned to play to their strengths. They have learned to choose certain careers, jobs, lifestyle choices that enable them to manage ADHD successfully and to limit or control the extent of the impairment they experience because of their ADHD. So there are many people in many types of careers who have ADHD who wouldn't dream of calling themselves in any way impaired or as having anything wrong with them or in any way disabled, because they have learned how to adapt and take a strength-based approach to their particular kind of neurology. So the ADHD doesn't go away. It's just that for at least half of us as adults, when we transition into adulthood, we have learned by then how to take a strength-based approach and have a lifestyle and choose a career that works best for an ADHD mind. What we do know is there has been quite a big increase in recent years of people being diagnosed with ADHD, both children and adults in the USA. There is a higher prevalence in the USA than in a lot of other countries. And there may be some reasons. There's been a lot of discussion and debate about this idea about, we know that ADHD is often being referred to as the adventurer gene, the innovator gene, the inventor gene. So, you know, if you look at people like Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, Leonardo da Vinci, all of whom are, according to scientists who've researched them, indicated that these famous scientists and inventors in history have had ADHD, but one of the things that marks them out is their risk-taking, their innovation, their adventurous spirit, and certainly that are, you know, all those things are qualities that could be described as essentially American, and what has made America a country that has had so much influence on the culture and the economy of the rest of the world. So again, it is about seeing ADHD through a slightly different lens other than a deficit-based or disorder-based model. In terms of the genes and the genetics, it is genetic. We know that approximately 80% there is genetic heritability. There are about 20% of cases where ADHD can be acquired as a result of brain injury. But what we do know is that, yes, certainly with epilepsy, even if there isn't a family history, that kind of brain injury might result in ADHD. We know that premature birth, and that's why we know a lot of IVF babies, about a third of IVF babies have ADHD, not because of the IVF process, but that premature birth, which is very common in IVF children. So we know that there are certain things in terms of perinatal trauma and early infant trauma that might trigger those ADHD gene variants. So if we think about how ADHD might be exacerbated by environmental factors, then it means that we can begin to understand that actually there are a number of different things that we can do that might influence how ADHD will present in children. And for those clinicians of you who are watching, because I know that there are a lot of clinicians who are participating in this webinar this evening, the World Federation for ADHD guide that was published in 2019 gives a very detailed analysis of the assessment, diagnosis and treatment of ADHD, and also quite extensive information around comorbidities, which is well worth a read for those of you who are working clinically in understanding the etiology and treatment interventions that are available and optimized for ADHD. In terms of comorbidity, and again, it's one of those medical terms, isn't it? But by that we mean co-occurring conditions. So with ADHD, we know, for example, that somewhere between 26 and 29% of people with a primary diagnosis of ADHD will also have autism. We know that approximately 1% will have Tourette's syndrome. We know that in many children with ADHD, they will go through a transitionary period where they might have tics, particularly when they're particularly anxious. That's certainly a lot of teens who in puberty and adolescence will go through a period of oppositional behaviour, which again is very common in all teens. And I think one of the things we've got to remember here is when we're talking about the traits of ADHD, such as inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, really, what child do you know who isn't a bit hyperactive, impulsive, inattentive? All children are like that because their brains are not fully developed until their late teens, early 20s. The characteristics of ADHD then are not unique in one sense. Really, what ADHD is, those same characteristics that are evident in all children, but they appear in a more extreme form. That is what ADHD is. It is a more extreme presentation of something that occurs naturally in all children. And as we grow and develop, and the environment that we live in influence that genetic presentation, then we begin to see how an individual can modify and reduce the impact, the negative impact of ADHD, but perhaps also strengthen some of the positives that come with ADHD as well. We know that there are other mental health comorbidities. We know that anxiety, for example, affects up to 40% of people with ADHD. We know that depression, therefore, is also common with ADHD. We do know that addiction is a particular vulnerability when it comes to people with ADHD. And we know that if they don't get early intervention and early treatment, then there is a greater risk that in adulthood they will self-medicate with alcohol, start smoking, maybe even substance misuse, or even kind of other addictive types of risk-taking behaviours that are not necessarily in their best long-term interests. In terms of other physiological conditions that we know frequently co-occur with ADHD, it's estimated that approximately 30% certainly of women will experience migraines. We know that hypertension is common in ADHD, which increases the risk then of early onset cardiovascular disease in later life, because that hypertension obviously is going to be poor for our cardiac health across the lifespan. There's even evidence that ADHD also predisposes us to certain allergies or a greater risk of asthma, and things like eating disorders. So we know that there is a link between obesity and ADHD, and therefore if the obesity isn't managed, then there's a greater risk of diabetes, which has other alarming physical health implications. So it is much more complex than just fidgety children who can't concentrate. It is demeaning to talk about ADHD in such a stereotypical way. It is misrepresenting completely just how impairing ADHD can be and why it is therefore worthy of the term disorder, because it can seriously disorder somebody's life if it's not identified and if it's not managed. But if it is identified early, if it is managed well, then the life chance trajectories in terms of physical health, mental health, educational progress and achievement, career, economic independence, all of those things are significantly improved, but we have to identify it in the first place. So how do we identify it? Well, traditionally, it's been through observational questionnaires such as Conners scales. But what we're seeing now in the 21st century with the advancements in technology is that where we've traditionally relied on observational questionnaires from parents and teachers when it comes to children and young people, I think we've all begun to realise, haven't we, that you can have two teachers in the same school who have a very different understanding or perception of the same child, and yet they both have differences of opinion about how they complete that. So similarly for parents, I think sometimes parents might want to see their child in a certain way, and that's reflected in the answers that they give. So for me, there are certain shortcomings with observational rating scales. I'm a great believer in the utility of cognitive functioning tests, like a QB test, which you can see on this screen, that actually measures cognitive functioning. And again, it's this idea, isn't it? ADHD is not a behavioural disorder. It's a neurodevelopmental condition. It is an impairment of cognition. Because when we talk about behavioural disorder, then immediately inferred in that is some kind of moral deficit. There is no moral deficit here. There is a difference between somebody, child or adult, choosing a behaviour that is destructive, hateful, harmful, unkind, or somebody who, with the best of intentions, makes a mistake that has poor consequences, either for themselves or for others around them. There is a difference. Intention is really quite important when we're talking about morality, and this is not about morality. So think in terms of neurodevelopmental condition, think in terms of cognitive impairment rather than a behavioural disorder. You could argue that every child, in terms of their emotional state, their mental health, anything that they do could be described as behavioural, because children do not have the self-awareness, the language skills, the emotional literacy, let alone a frontal lobe that is fully developed, to be able to understand themselves, their environment, their intentions, the consequences of their actions for themselves or anybody else. What child is ever going to be able to do that? So of course, how they communicate to us is always behaviourally. How many of you have seen your child distressed or upset, but rather than say to you, I am distressed and upset, I've got a tummy ache, I don't want to go to school today. They don't necessarily understand why they feel the way they do, but often they will report it in terms of how they are sensing it physically, or through that simple childlike fight or flight response that usually presents in avoidance. Yeah? So they don't fight with their parents or teachers who are 3 times their size. They don't run away from people who are 3 times their size and could easily catch up with them. They become avoidant. It is another way of avoiding stressful situations where they feel overwhelmed and unable to deal with the demands of their environment, wherever that might be. It's home, classroom, neighbourhood, playground, baseball court, whatever it is. So there is this trend towards a more quantitative clinical assessment that uses cognitive functioning screening like QB test, QB check, as well as those observational questionnaires, because here's the thing, you could have a very mild inattentive score but be doing really poorly in school, or you can have a really good attentive score on a cognitive functioning test and still also be doing really poorly in school. So your ADHD presentation might be more hyperactive, impulsive rather than inattentive, and yet you're still doing well at school. And that gives us information about how we treat ADHD. If we look at the different domains of cognitive impairment, then we can say, well, okay, maybe it's one of the reasons, your son or daughter is not doing so well in school is not because they are more inattentive, because actually the cognitive scores say that that's not really how their ADHD is impacting on them most. Maybe it's about the way they're being taught. And that has implications for how we treat them, because again, managing ADHD successfully is not just about medication. It is about a whole range of interventions and lifestyle choices. So in the USA, about 75% of all children undergo some type of treatment. Now, about a third of those will have ADHD medication and things like cognitive behavioural therapy. About 30% will take medication only. About 15% will just use behavioural therapy because medication isn't always suitable for every child. And maybe also it's because for various reasons their parents don't want to use medication. But we do know the ADHD medication is very effective. Pharmacologically, it has a very strong effect size of 0.9. And we do know that the combination of cognitive behavioural therapy, psychoeducation, as well as medication, optimizes how things can benefit the child. And there's some great information on a wonderful CDC-funded organisation in the United States called Attitude Magazine, and they can be found on attitudemag.com, which has a whole raft of really useful information for parents and clinicians and educators. So lifestyle influences we've talked about, really quite important, and nutritional support is particularly important. We know that there are deficiencies in vitamin D, in iron and zinc in an ADHD, and we're not quite sure what it is about ADHD genetic variants that impact on our ability to metabolize those vitamins. But what is a particular concern today is this link between fatty acids and ADHD. We know that 60% of the brain is made up of fatty acids, and we know that there is something about ADHD genetic variants that make it more difficult for us to metabolize and utilize omega-3 in particular, as well as a number of other minerals and neurotransmitters in terms of how effective they are. So if we're talking about environmental factors, we have to talk about things like daily exercise, good sleep hygiene, daily habitual stress reduction strategies, not just as a reactive tool, but as a part of daily life. If you really want to change your lifestyle, if you really want to manage ADHD well, then it has to be about daily habitual lifestyle choices, and healthy nutrition is a crucial part of that. So a balanced diet with proportionate levels of protein are really important. A diet high in carbohydrates means that you're just going to have these rushes of energy and then a real plummet of energy, and this kind of wide variation can actually impact on our moods. So we all know that poor sleep impacts on our moods, but for those of you that have a high carbohydrate diet, that can also affect your moods. And we know that mood stabilization is an issue for those who have emotional self-regulation difficulties, like those with ADHD. Of course, when we're tired and hungry, we crave carbohydrate because it gives us a boost of energy. But actually, the energy we get from protein is actually released in a more steady and lasting way. And that's why we say that breakfast really is the most important meal of the day. and that breakfast absolutely must contain elements of protein, whether it's beans, eggs, meat, cheese, soya, anything. Protein has to be part of that breakfast. And if you've got a hyperactive child, I'm sorry, but a bowl of cereal, which is all carbohydrate, is not going to sustain them through the morning until recess at school. It's not going to give the brain the energy it needs, because a child who is hyperactive is going to burn off those the energy from carbohydrates really quite quickly. So omega-3 and 6 fatty acids, which are commonly found in fish oil and certain plant-based sources, have been proven to actually help support brain development in all children, but it seems to be particularly efficacious in children with ADHD. And it also, according to the research, suggests that when it's used as an adjunct to ADHD medications, such as methylphenidate and Vyvanse, that this seems to enhance the ability of the individual to regulate and manage ADHD. In other words, there is a synergy between ADHD medications and omega supplements. So if you look at this particular graph here, what we're seeing here is that there is a real connection, because the ratio that we see of 3 and 6 is really important in terms of our diet, because omega-6 GLA is often seen as it's an inflammatory substance, a nutrient. And it's important that we need all of these omegas, but we need them in the right balance. And this is really crucial in terms of how we utilize any kind of supplementation with a health food like omega supplements, because we need to understand that ADHD is associated with an impaired omega fatty acid balance. And if you think in terms of, there are certain genes such as FADS1, FADS2 that we know are really genetically hot regions in terms of ADHD on the 11th chromosome, and also the genes that code for desaturase enzymes such as delta 5 and delta 6 that convert essential fatty acids into long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, that we need to understand that there are certain specific inborn genetic differences found in many individuals with ADHD, and that those differences actually can reduce the functional efficiency of enzymes that serve to limit how we metabolize fatty acids in the brain. And I mentioned before that the brain is made up of about 60% of fatty acids. So, again, in ADHD, recognizing that there are different alleles can result in different forms of these enzymes, and that can mean that they are less efficient at processing omega fatty acids and therefore generally brain function. So if you think about this in terms of, if you look at the pro-inflammatory GLA sort of omega-6 represented in the grey here, and you compare that with that balanced sort of EPA, DHA, GLA combination, then we know that that combination really does balance out and modulates any inflammatory response. And remember that what we have learned in terms of a lot of physiological illnesses, that they are usually inflammatory responses that are telling us something about our health. And the great thing again here about the omega supplements and the link as well to immune functioning, that all of these things really help to balance that metabolization and utility of fatty acids that seems to be a particular need in those with ADHD. And in this particular instance, what we're talking about is this ratio of 9:3:1 that actually helps to rebalance the omega fatty acid levels that support healthy fatty acid metabolism in the brain and the nervous system. So those with ADHD have alleles which further hinder the conversion of omega-6, which we know is closely linked with inflammatory responses. And the omega-3 and the ratio that we've just talked about helps to balance that out in a way that optimizes the metabolism and the utility of those fatty acids. So in other words, what we're saying here is that nutritional supplementation with a medical food such as omega-3 can be actually, from a clinical point of view, incredibly effective in helping young children, adults with ADHD who have difficulty with the metabolism of fatty acids, but actually it can work incredibly powerfully as an adjunct to medications like methylphenidate, or Ritalin as it's known as well. So by providing the optimum levels of 3 and 6 at the right ratio, we can actually overcome that imbalance that derives from poor metabolism of omega that's caused by the genetic variation in ADHD. So Equizen Pro, we know that Equizen Pro supports attentional control, even improves things like vocabulary and immediate memory recall. The research here is extensive, and I can say from personal experience that it's one of the reasons really why I've agreed to do that, because the ADHD Foundation has only ever actually endorsed 5 products or services in the 14 years that we've existed. And one of those is Equizen Pro, and the reason for that is I personally have used this particular brand of product myself for over 20 years, and that was why I was more than happy to do this, because it's not something that we do as an organisation very often in terms of a particular product or service. But I also know as well from our social media feed, we have about 150,000 social media followers, that whenever we post any research about omega-3 supplementation, the response that we get is overwhelmingly positive in terms of the impact that it has, particularly on children and young people across a range of indices. So if we think, if we're looking at all the research, we know that in human studies that the addition of omega-3 EPA fish oil in a balanced ratio to GLA, which is omega-6, has been shown to reduce the activity of a delta-5 desaturase and reduce the elevations in serum and arachidonic acid. So, the evidence is really clear here that the supplementation really does successfully support long-chain fatty acid metabolism. And if we think about some of the research that's been done, here we know that, again, supplementation with Equizen Pro has actually shown significant measurable improvements in things like spelling, reading and memory. The evidence is unequivocal. There's nothing here to prove here. It's just about getting out that information to parents, to clinicians, to educators, to anybody, including young people themselves and adults who have ADHD, that there is scientific proven benefit to actually supplementing with something like Equizen Pro. And again, more evidence here that actually shows that after 3 months of supplementation, you're already seeing a 3 times improvement in spelling, reading, and double the improvement in spelling for those that have been using Equizen Pro. So again, this is in this particular slide, you can see the impact where there's the combination of Equizen and methylphenidate or Ritalin, and you can see here that it's really quite clear that there is a substantial improvement both in terms of spelling and also in terms of tolerability to medication. So we know that for some children where they may have unpleasant side effects, that seems to have been lessened by adding omega into the treatment regimen. Again, really, I think the evidence speaks for itself, doesn't it? So, really just like to kind of conclude by saying that I think, I am very passionate about ADHD. I'm very passionate about a multimodal approach to ADHD. I think whatever works is good, but remembering that each and every one of us is an individual, that the presentation of ADHD in each and every one of us is slightly different, that our experiences, our early environment, our ability to adapt to that environment, lifetime events, some of which may have been adverse, all of those things impact on us, but they make us the unique and special individual human being that we are. I think the world is a much, much better place for people with ADHD. I'm always delighted and thoroughly enjoy particularly working with young people who have ADHD. I'm really encouraged by a lot of the advances, and particularly some of the great work that's been done by some remarkable clinicians in the USA who I've already mentioned, who very much led the way and been well ahead of certainly what's been happening in the UK. But also, again, I think, recognizing that a multimodal approach means, yes, medication for some, but for parents, for educators, for other clinicians, psychologists, nutritionists, that means daily, habitual lifestyle changes that enable every individual to realize and achieve their potential. Yes, of course, there are challenges, but let's take a strength-based approach. And again, my particular thanks, I think, here in terms of Equizen, because our celebration of neurodiversity here in the UK, which has really captured the whole zeitgeist here. Even government departments have celebrations of neurodiversity in the workplace now. We have Neurodiversity Celebration Week in March 2021. I'd really like to thank Equizen, who've always had a passion for the benefit of omega supplementation and as a health food for those with ADHD, and also being really strong advocates for neurodiversity. I think their track record on that speaks for itself, and that's why I'm particularly pleased and delighted to be able to talk to you today about Equizen Pro and the potential benefits for all of you. So again, brief summary here of some of the key points around ADHD, but really just to leave you with this kind of final point, and that is that, let us really, applaud and celebrate the 1 in 5 of us who are neurodiverse, and in the States, the 1 in 10 of you who have ADHD, and let's look at how, through better understanding, that we can ensure that the daily lifestyle choices that we make are going to enable our children to thrive and achieve their potential right across the lifespan. Thank you very much indeed. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Good night.